Welcome to one of the darkest chapters in Pennsylvania's history. Before we dive in, I'd love for you to share in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time of day or night you're listening. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide these stories reach. Picture this: your footsteps echo against the cracked tiles of Ravenwood Asylum, a towering Victorian institution hidden deep in the forests of western Pennsylvania. Built in 1887, it was meant to house those deemed too difficult for society. By 1904, it was suddenly shut down, and to this day no official record explains why. What happened inside those walls was so disturbing that the state locked it away until 1961, when a simple transfer of old medical files uncovered a secret that had been buried for decades. In the fall of 1903, Dr. William Harrison, a respected alienist from Philadelphia, arrived for what should have been a routine inspection. For 6 weeks, he took notes, but those notes never appeared in any public report. Instead, his private journal, unearthed during the demolition of the asylum's East Wing in 1962, revealed the truth. It spoke of cruelty dressed up as treatment of patients silenced, and of a medical establishment that chose to look the other way. This is not a story of ghosts or spirits. The horror of Ravenwood was entirely man-made, which is what makes it so chilling. The truth was deliberately hidden, warped, and forgotten. Everything you're about to hear comes from evidence, patient logs, staff testimonies, administrative records, and Dr. Harrison's own words. The names of certain patients have been changed, but their suffering was real. Ravenwood's terror didn't come from the supernatural. It came from the hands of those entrusted to care for the vulnerable. That is what makes it terrifying. Built 17 miles outside Pittsburgh, Ravenwood was placed where cries couldn't be heard and where families could abandon relatives without shame. It sat between two hills surrounded by oak and maple trees that burned red in the autumn, and the nearest town was 7 miles away along muddy roads, nearly impassable in winter. Records show that in 1903 alone, Ravenwood lost 37 staff members. Most left with vague excuses, illness, family issues, personal reasons. But none of them stayed in the area. They scattered across the country, disappearing without a trace. And so, on a cold October morning in 1903, Dr. Harrison's carriage rattled up to Ravenwood's iron gates. What he was about to uncover would shake the very foundation of mental health care in America. The Pennsylvania Medical Board had begun receiving troubling hints about Ravenwood. Nothing concrete, just anonymous letters written in disguised hands, whispering about practices that crossed ethical lines and treated the mentally ill as experimental material instead of human beings in need of care. To look into these claims, the board turned to Dr. William Harrison. He was considered the state's leading authority on psychiatric care, a Johns Hopkins educated physician whose work had appeared in respected journals and whose reputation rested on his belief in humane treatment. From the very first day, his journal reflected unease. He described Ravenwood as outwardly magnificent, its Gothic revival design projecting progress and healing. Yet the impression was misleading. The large windows seemed to swallow light instead of reflecting it. The carefully groomed grounds were curiously empty of patients enjoying fresh air, and the very layout of the facility felt off. The 4-story granite structure quarried from nearby hills had pointed arches, steep gables, and ornate trim. But its windows were placed at odd angles, corridors twisted in confusing ways, and the grounds were broken up by ivy-covered walls that carved the property into isolated courtyards with no visibility between them. Harrison was welcomed by Dr. Malcolm Thorne, Ravenwood's medical director, since 1896. Thorne was a man of contradictions, praised in county records as brilliant, credited with elevating Ravenwood into a premier institution for wealthy families seeking discretion, yet described in Harrison's notes as cold and unsettling. Tall and gaunt, with silver hair slicked back and pale eyes that seemed to look through people, Thorne carried himself with a quiet precision that forced others to lean in unconsciously, ceding authority. His credentials were beyond question. Harvard trained with research in Vienna and Paris, but his detachment was chilling. He spoke of patients by diagnosis instead of name, reducing them to conditions rather than lives. When Harrison requested access to every ward, he thought he noticed something flicker across Thorne's face, a brief hesitation gone almost as soon as it appeared. Thorne quickly reassured him that Ravenwood had nothing to conceal. Yet in time, Harrison's inspection would reveal enough to shake the very foundation of psychiatric care in Pennsylvania. So disturbing were his findings that the state sealed the report until 1961, fearing that public knowledge could erode trust in medical institutions and reopen wounds for families of those once committed. At first glance, Ravenwood presented the appearance of a model asylum. The wards were orderly, the patients well-dressed, the routine structured, and the staff seemingly professional. But beneath this carefully managed facade lay truths that Harrison was only beginning to suspect, and which his journal would later record in chilling detail. Harrison's first impression of Ravenwood's wards was deceptive. The bedding was clean, the heating systems worked well, and the communal rooms were spacious enough for crafts and reading. On the surface, it all looked like a model institution. But in his journal that evening, Harrison wrote that something felt wrong. The patients were unnervingly still. In every other asylum he had known, there was always a hum of energy, conversations, movement, even the occasional outburst. At Ravenwood, there was only silence. The patient's eyes followed staff members, not with trust, but with a quiet dread. None smiled, none approached, none seemed at ease. Harrison concluded this wasn't calm born of treatment, but submission born of fear. Their appearances added to his unease. Each patient was well-groomed, which in itself was unusual, since many with severe mental illness neglected self-care. But here their grooming was too uniform, hair cropped to identical lengths, posture rigid, and straight movements oddly synchronized. To Harrison, this looked less like natural behavior and more like conditioning. That night, as he settled into the guest quarters, provided for visiting physicians, Harrison noticed details that unsettled him further. The room was well appointed with carved oak furniture, a coal fireplace, and a writing desk overlooking the grounds. Yet the door locked only from the outside, and the large window was sealed shut. As he tried to sleep, he heard it for the first time, a faint rhythmic tapping carried through the pipes. At first he dismissed it as the creaking of an old building. Later he would come to realize it was something far more deliberate, a signal. The next morning, Harrison began his formal review of Ravenwood's patient files. At first glance, the documentation was thorough, even exemplary. Each record listed treatments, behaviors, and progress in neat, precise language. But to Harrison, the records were too perfect. Real patients didn't improve in such neat trajectories, and real treatments didn't yield such predictable results. These files read less like authentic case notes and more like staged demonstrations. He requested files for patients discharged as cured within the past year. Thorne provided them without hesitation, but Harrison quickly noticed a disturbing pattern. None of these so-called recovered patients had returned to their families or former lives. Instead, they had been quietly transferred to convalescent homes or supervised facilities in distant states. It was as if recovery at Ravenwood meant disappearance, not reintegration. His concern deepened when he asked to interview patients in private. Thorne resisted, claiming it might disrupt treatment routines, but Harrison reminded him of his authority from the state medical board. Reluctantly, Thorne allowed it, though he stationed an orderly nearby. During the interviews, Harrison found the patients eerily consistent. They spoke as if rehearsed, repeating the same praises of Thorne's methods, expressing identical gratitude for their care. words were uniform, but their eyes told a different story: fear, weariness, and something unspoken. One woman in particular stood out to him. She was in her 30s, her file describing hysterical melancholia after the death of her husband. Something about her demeanor, the tension behind her practiced words, would soon draw Harrison deeper into Ravenwood's darkest secrets. During his private interview, Harrison encountered a chilling moment of clarity. While the orderly's attention drifted for only a second, the woman patient leaned closer and whispered, "We're not all still here." Before he could press her, she snapped back into the same empty, rehearsed answers as the others, as if the words had never been spoken at all. Later that day, Harrison crossed paths with Eleanor Sullivan, a young nurse barely 3 months into her tenure at Ravenwood. She stood out, immediately nervous, avoiding eye contact, her manner carrying a haunted edge that contrasted sharply with the practiced calm of her colleagues. When Thorne stepped away briefly, she slipped Harrison a folded scrap of paper. Scrawled in hurried script were 5 words: "North Wing Basement Midnight, come alone." That evening, Harrison pored over more records. The patterns were damning. For all of Ravenwood's reputation as a place of advanced care, patients rarely left cured. Families received carefully worded updates about progress that never translated into recovery. Death records troubled him most, on average 3 each month, all attributed to vague natural causes or complications of mental illness. None showed autopsies. Worse still, many bodies weren't returned to families, but buried in a small cemetery hidden on the asylum grounds, a graveyard conveniently absent from official tours. When Harrison raised the matter, Thorne brushed it aside, insisting the focus should remain on living patients who could benefit from modern science. When the clock in the main hall struck midnight, Harrison made his way toward the north wing. The building's layout worked against him. Hallways twisted back on themselves, doors led to unexpected places, and the basement access was disguised behind a cabinet in a neglected linen room. With only a lamp in hand, he descended into the darkness. The air turned damp and cold, the walls rough stone that gave way in places to raw earthen tunnels. The space stretched far larger than the building above, suggesting secret excavations added long after Ravenwood's construction. There in the shadows waited Eleanor Sullivan, trembling with fear. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "They watch us always. But someone has to tell you." What she revealed formed the heart of Harrison's hidden investigation. Beneath Ravenwood's respectable facade was a covert program of experimental treatments carried out in an unlisted section of the basement known only to staff as the laboratory. The subjects were carefully chosen patients with no close relatives, no powerful families to ask questions if they disappeared. "Patients come back different," Sullivan told him. "Not better, different. They're compliant, hollow, empty. Dr. Thorne calls it breaking the cycle of illness. But he's breaking people." She described screams echoing through the stone halls, then silence, the silence always worse. Sullivan had arrived full of hope, fresh from her training in Philadelphia, eager to practice progressive psychiatric medicine. What she found instead was a system built on secrecy and rigid control. Staff were divided, each given narrow duties, with no sense of the bigger picture. No one knew everything, and those who asked too many questions disappeared, either reassigned, dismissed, or in some cases never seen again. For Harrison Sullivan's testimony confirmed what his instincts already suspected: Ravenwood's calm exterior was a mask hiding horrors that could not survive daylight. Only a handful of staff were ever allowed into Thorne's secret circle, and their admission was no accident. According to Sullivan, he tested new hires by assigning them increasingly troubling duties. Small cruelties at first, then escalating tasks. Those who balked were dismissed as unsuitable. Those who obeyed were promoted. Sullivan, determined to survive long enough to expose what she had seen, wore the mask of compliance, while secretly recording details. She even managed to secure a copy of a key to the restricted areas, made by pressing warm wax against the original, during a fleeting moment when a senior orderly she had charmed let his guard down. Before leaving Harrison that night, she gripped his arm hard and warned him in a low voice, "Be cautious with what you report." Thorne had powerful allies in Harrisburg, and inspectors who voiced concerns had a way of vanishing from professional life. One she claimed had even been committed to an asylum in Maryland, his objections recast as delusions. The next day, Harrison went through the motions of an ordinary inspection. Outwardly, he asked routine questions and recorded standard notes. Privately, he was mapping locked doors, absent from official blueprints, noting staff who only worked night shifts and puzzling over patients whose charts showed regular treatments, but whom he never saw in any ward. He studied the pharmacy records carefully. While the dispensary shelves held the expected medicines of the era bromides, chloral hydrate morphine supply logs revealed something far stranger. Shipments of compounds common in experimental laboratories, not medical institutions. That night, armed with Sullivan's key, Harrison slipped into the North Wing basement. What he found shook him deeply. The hidden laboratory stretched far beyond what the official plan suggested, its rooms fitted with surgical tables, strapped for restraint rows of instruments, glinting under lantern-light cabinets filled with precise patient charts and notebooks written in Thorne's meticulous hand. Harrison began a second journal, then one he kept apart from his official notes and concealed in his quarters. It would later be discovered during Ravenwood's demolition in 1962, offering the clearest picture of what really happened there. Thorne's writings revealed practices that masqueraded as medicine, but were in truth refined systems of cruelty. He had devised methods to break the human will, blending isolation pain and custom-made chemicals to reduce patients to shells before attempting to rebuild them in his own image of mental order. He called the process cognitive reconstruction. It began with what he chillingly named the erasure phase: weeks of darkness, disrupted sleep, chemical sedation, and relentless cycles of noise and silence, until patients reached states of complete disorientation. Then came inscription systematic conditioning by reward and punishment hypnosis, and carefully dosed compounds to mold thought and behavior. The choice of subjects was deliberate. Patients from wealthy families received standard though largely ineffective care. Those from poorer backgrounds with no advocates to ask questions became the raw material for Thorne's experiments. Worst of all were those labeled permanent research subjects, people with no hope of release, kept alive only for ongoing trials. Among Thorne's obsessions was what he termed memory architecture, the idea that memory could be selectively erased or altered. One of his entries chilled Harrison's Subject 38. No longer recalls her former life as a school teacher, yet retains all her academic knowledge. When shown photographs of her pupils, she exhibits no recognition. When given lesson materials, she demonstrates flawless competence. The selective erasure was successful. Here in the damp underground of Ravenwood, Harrison realized he had uncovered not just mistreatment, but a systematic rewriting of human identity, an erasure of self carried out under the guise of medical progress. Among the papers hidden in Thorne's office, Harrison uncovered something even darker than the experiments themselves, proof that Ravenwood's horrors were not the isolated work of a single madman. Letters bore the signatures of some of the most respected physicians in America and Europe, names that carried weight in psychiatric medicine. They praised Thorne's innovations, requested updates, and some had even traveled to Ravenwood to observe the procedures firsthand. This wasn't just one doctor's twisted obsession. It was the logical, chilling extension of a philosophy that treated certain lives as expendable for the sake of progress. Worse still was a ledger that laid bare a network of financial partnerships. Pharmaceutical companies and medical equipment manufacturers, masked by pseudonyms, but recognizable to Harrison as major suppliers for hospitals across the Northeast had supplied Thorne with experimental compounds and specialized devices. In exchange, Thorne provided detailed reports on their effects when tested on living patients. What Ravenwood had become was not a sanctuary, but a hidden laboratory at the center of a larger system willing to sacrifice the vulnerable for profit and reputation. Harrison spent the entire night carefully copying documents, diagrams, and entries from Thorne's journals. He described in his notes how difficult it was to keep his hands steady, how each discovery deepened the pit in his stomach. As the first gray light of morning crept through the sealed windows, he returned everything exactly as he had found it and retreated to his quarters. In his journal, he wrote, "I must move cautiously. If Thorne suspects me, the records will vanish, and I may join the patients in his experiments. Evidence and witnesses must be secured. Only then will the truth see daylight." Over the following days, Harrison walked a dangerous line. By day, he maintained the role of an inspector, asking routine questions and nodding at Thorne's explanations. By night, he mapped Ravenwood in detail, marking hidden corridors and locked chambers, quietly observing patients who bore the marks of the experimental protocols. He also began seeking allies staff members whose unease betrayed their silence, though fear kept them from speaking openly. One patient drew his focus more than any other patient 47. Unlike the others whose wills had been stripped away, she showed flickers of resistance. Behind her subdued demeanor, Harrison noticed her tapping her fingers in deliberate patterns on tables, on walls, even through the plumbing. It was the same rhythmic sequence he had heard on his first night. Consulting a reference text, he realized it was Morse code. The message was always the same BOW. Patient 47's official file claimed she was a hopeless case of delusional psychosis, admitted in 1901 under the false name Jane Smith. There were no family connections, no prior medical history, and unusually sparse intake notes. But Thorne's private research entries revealed the truth. She had once been a nurse at another facility who witnessed something she wasn't meant to see. Rather than silence her through dismissal, she was brought to Ravenwood, where Thorne's treatment sought to erase her memories while preserving her medical skills. On the night of October 29th, following the clues she had given through her tapping, Harrison searched for hidden access points beneath the main basement laboratory. What he found there would take him even deeper into Ravenwood's buried secrets. Behind the heavy storage cabinet, Harrison found what no blueprint acknowledged: a narrow staircase leading to a sub-level hidden from every official plan. The steps were smooth from years of secret use, proof that this place was no mere afterthought. At the bottom, a massive iron door waited its intricate lock far beyond the simple ward Sullivan's key could open. Harrison retreated, returning the next night with tools quietly borrowed from the maintenance shed. It took nearly an hour of tense, careful work before the lock surrendered and the door creaked open. What lay beyond was worse than anything he had imagined. The hidden floor was a ring of cells, circling a central chamber lined with examination tables and equipment. 17 cells were occupied. Several others stood empty, but still bore the marks of recent use. Inside the cells, patients lived, or rather endured, in conditions so brutal Harrison could barely comprehend them. The spaces were so small a person could hardly stretch out. There was no proper light, no sanitation. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of rot, chemical residue, and despair. The people inside were the failures, those who hadn't responded to Thorne's protocols but couldn't be released or allowed to speak. Some tracked Harrison's movements with hollow eyes. Others were catatonic, or so altered they no longer seemed fully present. Many bore scars from crude surgical interventions, trepanning holes drilled into their skulls, sutures behind their ears, restraint marks scarring wrists and ankles. As Harrison moved from cell to cell, he realized he recognized names patients officially listed as dead from natural causes or transferred to other facilities. These people had been erased from the records kept alive, only as permanent test subjects. In the central area, he found a journal unlike Thorne's clinical notebooks upstairs. This one was written in a flowing, almost elegant hand, full of personal reflections. One passage chilled Harrison. The mind properly unmade becomes like clay, infinitely malleable. We have been working with crude tools, attempting to excise mental illness like surgeons removing a tumor. The true advancement lies not in removing dysfunction, but in reconstructing consciousness itself. The implications extend far beyond treatment of the insane. This wasn't just about psychiatry. It was about control, about reshaping people from the inside out. The next morning, as Harrison resumed his official rounds, something had changed. Staff members fell silent when he entered rooms. Orderlies shadowed him at a distance. And Dr. Thorne, polite as ever, suggested that perhaps Harrison had gathered enough information and might consider ending his inspection early. Most troubling of all, Eleanor Sullivan had vanished. When Harrison asked after her, he was told she'd left suddenly for a family emergency. That night he wrote in his journal, "They know." Or at least they suspect. Perhaps the hidden floor has alarms. Perhaps I was seen with Sullivan's key. My belongings are disturbed when I return to my room. I must accelerate my plan. If the documents I've gathered don't leave these grounds soon, they'll vanish as completely as the patients below. That night, Harrison gathered everything he had uncovered, maps of the hidden wards, copied patient files. Thorne's own notes and the names of men and women erased from official records. He tucked it all into a false compartment sewn inside the lining of his medical bag. His plan was simple but desperate: leave at dawn, under the pretense of a family emergency, reach Harrisburg, and place the evidence directly before the state medical board and the governor himself. But Thorne anticipated him. Just as Harrison prepared for bed, a knock came at his door. Two orderlies stood waiting, their faces unreadable. "Dr. Thorne requests your immediate assistance. A patient in crisis." Harrison's instincts screamed a warning, but refusal would have exposed his suspicions. He followed them, only to find himself ushered not into a ward, but into Thorne's private office. The office was as coldly precise as the man himself. Shelves of medical journals lined the walls, their spines worn from use. Behind the desk hung a single painting, a Renaissance anatomical study of a man stripped of skin, muscles, and nerves, rendered in painstaking detail. The room glowed under electric lamps, a rare luxury for the time-proof of Ravenwood's deep coffers. Thorne sat at his desk, composed, a glass of amber liquid in hand. Another glass waited across from him, poured but untouched. "William," he said smoothly, as though greeting an old friend. "Let us speak openly as colleagues. Professional courtesy." In Harrison's final journal entry, written only hours later, he described the chilling realization Thorne knew everything. He knew of the midnight explorations, the secret notes, even Harrison's contact with patient 47. Yet there was no anger, no bluster. Instead, Thorne spoke with the calm of a man convinced of his own righteousness. He framed his work as the natural next step in medicine. "All progress demands sacrifice," he told Harrison. The men and women here were already lost to society. Through them, we discover methods that will save thousands. Thorne laid out his philosophy in precise, persuasive terms. He was not experimenting, he insisted, but pioneering the reconstruction of consciousness. Just as early surgeons had been condemned for cutting into living bodies, only to be hailed later as visionaries, so too would psychiatry one day revere his work. Consider Thorne pressed patients who arrive violent, destructive, unreachable, leaving as calm, orderly citizens. their pain and chaos stripped away, replaced with stability. Is that not the highest form of healing? To end suffering by removing the capacity for it. Then came the offer delivered as if it were a gift. Harrison could join him as an equal, with limitless resources, protected from scrutiny, free to publish revolutionary research that would cement his name in history. Or he could refuse and see his reputation destroyed. Thorne claimed he could manufacture charges of misconduct, even commitment papers. Your legacy versus progress, he concluded softly. I offer you the chance of a lifetime. Harrison declined the drink set before him, convinced it had been laced with one of Thorne's compounds. Feigning exhaustion, he asked for time to consider the proposal. Thorne agreed, but when Harrison was escorted back to his quarters, the orderlies remained stationed outside. No longer guardians, jailers. In what would be his final words, Harrison wrote, I am under no illusions. By morning I will either escape with the evidence or I will vanish into Ravenwood silence like the others. I have hidden this journal where I pray a future investigator might discover it. Should these words be found, let them stand as testament. The horror of Ravenwood was real. If you're reading these words, understand this. What happened at Ravenwood was not an isolated atrocity. It was part of a broader philosophy creeping into psychiatric medicine, one that treated the vulnerable not as people in need of care, but as raw material for experimentation. The patients here were not the only victims. They were the warning. What happened next remains tangled in contradictions. According to the official record, Dr. William Harrison suffered a sudden mental collapse during his inspection. He was declared delusional, accused of making baseless charges against the respected Dr. Thorne, and quietly transported to a private institution in upstate New York. There, he reportedly died of mental exhaustion in early 1904. His inspection notes were dismissed as unreliable and sealed away, but other accounts tell a different story. Newspaper clippings from November 1903 mention a small fire at Ravenwood minor damage quickly contained no injuries. Yet county fire logs show multiple wagons dispatched and several responders hurt. More damning still, insurance claims filed by Ravenwood list heavy damage to the administrative wing, including Thorne's office and the guest quarters, exactly where Harrison's evidence had been hidden. Local memory holds further clues. Decades later, elderly residents recalled that night carriages moving in and out until dawn, lights blazing in the asylum, figures carried on stretchers, or marching in eerie straight lines into covered wagons bound for the train station. Something had happened, something far larger than a minor fire. In December 1903, Dr. Thorne abruptly resigned, citing ill health, and relocated to Vienna. There he continued his work until his death in 1917. His later publications, while polished and stripped of incriminating details, bore unmistakable traces of methods first tested at Ravenwood. Meanwhile, the asylum itself limped on until September 1904, when a state investigation sparked by anonymous letters to Pennsylvania newspapers forced its closure. The patients were transferred elsewhere, the records sealed, and Ravenwood was abandoned. Yet the shadow lingered. Within a few years, other psychiatric institutions across the Northeast introduced new treatment protocols, refined and disguised versions of Thorne's methods. They were hailed as innovations, with no mention of their true tainted origin. Several physicians who had once corresponded with Thorne enjoyed celebrated careers, their ties to Ravenwood carefully scrubbed from their biographies. For decades, the truth stayed buried. Then in 1961, a routine transfer of old medical records to the state archives unearthed something extraordinary. A junior clerk, Margaret Wires, noticed a bundle of papers that didn't match the rest. Inside were fragments of Harrison's documentation, floor plans, patient records, and journal pages that contradicted the official story. But even this revelation slipped into the margins of history. Wires later claimed that soon after her discovery, some of the files mysteriously vanished from the archives. And so the story of Ravenwood remained what it had always been, half truth, half erasure, a whisper buried under official silence. A story that suggests the most terrifying horrors are not supernatural at all, but human, conceived in the name of progress, carried out under the banner of science, and hidden in plain sight. When Margaret Wires reported the disappearance of Harrison's rediscovered papers, her supervisors assured her the documents had been reclassified for security reasons and transferred to a restricted access facility. Shortly afterward, she was quietly reassigned to another department and told in no uncertain terms never to raise the subject again. Then, in 1962, as demolition crews assessed the crumbling eastern wing of Ravenwood, they made a discovery that reignited the whispers. Hidden inside a wall cavity near Harrison's old quarters was a sealed metal box. Inside were his journals, photographic plates showing the sub-level conditions, and sealed vials later confirmed to contain Thorne's experimental compounds. The find sparked a brief wave of public attention. A reporter at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette began publishing a serialized exposé on Ravenwood. But the series ended abruptly after its first installment. The reporter was reassigned to the sports desk, and a printed retraction claimed the story relied on unsubstantiated evidence. The recovered materials disappeared soon after. The most shocking revelation came in 1968, when developers preparing to build housing on Ravenwood's old grounds unearthed a mass grave. At least 42 bodies were found, many showing signs of crude surgical interventions, trepanning scars, cranial incisions, and in several cases, implanted plates and bizarre devices that did not correspond with any known medical practice of the early 20th century. 6 skulls contained tiny glass vials embedded in the brain cavity, traces of chemical compounds still clinging inside, though too degraded for full analysis. County records listed no cemetery at that site, and within weeks, the entire project was quietly abandoned. The land was reclassified as a protected nature preserve, its history buried with the bones. The larger question that has haunted historians ever since is how much the broader medical establishment knew. Correspondence recovered from Thorne's personal files makes it clear that colleagues across the US and Europe were aware of his work, some even supportive. A number of physicians who later received patients transferred from Ravenwood praised their miraculous recoveries, never acknowledging, or perhaps never questioning, the disturbing uniformity of their behavior. A historian of psychiatric medicine has noted that mid-20th century institutions adopted practices bearing uncanny resemblance to Thorne's experiments, regimented conditioning, chemical sedation, paired with suggestion, the deliberate reshaping of thought patterns. Though psychiatry has since abandoned these methods, their fingerprints lingered in institutional practice well into the 1950s. As for Eleanor Sullivan, her fate remains unresolved. No Pennsylvania nursing registry ever listed her name. Some claim she was a fabrication by Thorne himself, a carefully planted figure designed to test Harrison's discretion. Others insist she was real silenced when her knowledge became too dangerous. In 1967, a set of documents surfaced suggesting that a woman closely matching Sullivan's description was admitted to a Maryland asylum in late 1903. Diagnosed with hysterical delusions about medical misconduct. The files report she died there in 1907. Ravenwood's ruins are long gone, its grounds sealed under the guise of preservation. Yet the story refuses to die. Between the graves, the vanished documents, and the echoes of Thorne's methods in later psychiatric care, one truth remains clear: what happened in those halls was not the madness of one man, but a philosophy that nearly became medicine. Certain fragments of Harrison's notes and later research suggest that Eleanor Sullivan's role may not have been as straightforward as it seemed. Though remembered as the frightened young nurse who risked everything to help Harrison, her knowledge of Ravenwood's most secret protocols was unusually precise for someone so new to the staff. Some historians argue she might have been more than she appeared, perhaps even a former patient who had undergone partial cognitive reconstruction. If so, Thorne may have placed her within the nursing ranks to test new staff for disloyalty. In that theory, Sullivan's conscience began to fracture as suppressed memories resurfaced, driving her to help Harrison in defiance of her conditioning. Whether she was a victim, a pawn, or both, her fate remains uncertain. Patient 47 is an even greater mystery. She was the one whose Morse code messages first alerted Harrison to the horrors beneath Ravenwood. Yet her identity was never uncovered. None of the bodies discovered in the 1968 mass grave could be conclusively identified as hers. The only surviving clue is a chilling entry in Thorne's private research notes praising a remarkably resilient female subject who retained awareness despite repeated cerebral modifications. The note ends coldly. Subject terminated due to persistent communication attempts. Brain preserved for further study. And yet, in 1955, a curious article appeared in a psychiatric journal describing an unnamed woman admitted to a Philadelphia hospital in 1904. She had no memory of who she was, yet displayed an uncanny ability to transcribe entire texts in Morse code simply by tapping her fingers. According to the article, she communicated primarily through written notes, describing fragmented memories of a place below where minds were unmade. The record claims she was eventually discharged into the care of a supposed relative and disappeared from history. Was she patient 47, surviving somehow beyond Ravenwood? The question lingers unanswered. Today, what remains of Ravenwood Asylum lies deep in the Pennsylvania woods, slowly swallowed by nature. The State Historical Office has refused to classify it as a protected site, dismissing it as insignificant. But for those who visit, its presence is anything but forgettable. Locals avoid the grounds not from superstition, but from the weight of knowing what took place there. Travelers who step inside describe not the thrill of chasing ghosts, but a visceral unease, the kind that comes from standing where cruelty was normalized, where suffering was systematized, and where medicine itself was twisted into a weapon. The asylum's ruins remain ivy crawling up cracked granite walls, trees splitting through collapsed roofs, wildlife nesting where patients once lived and died. Its windows gape like dark sockets staring out into the forest. The true horror of Ravenwood was never supernatural. It was human. It was the deliberate erasure of identity, the reduction of people to subjects, the quiet complicity of a system willing to look away. Perhaps most disturbing of all is that Thorne's legacy did not die with him or with the asylum's closure. Medical records from institutions across Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland in the 1910s and 1920s show unmistakable traces of his methods, modified, renamed, institutionalized. Cognitive restructuring, chemical conditioning, the reshaping of memory and behavior. Techniques born in Ravenwood's basement, whispered about as innovation and folded quietly into the history of psychiatric care. By the early 20th century, Thorne's name had all but vanished from mainstream psychiatric literature. His later writings, relegated to obscure European journals, received little attention in America, even as his methods quietly lived on. Sanitized of their most grotesque elements, they resurfaced in modified forms across asylums in the Northeast, breaking down undesirable mental patterns through chemical and psychological pressure, then rebuilding patients into something more socially acceptable. What was erased completely was any acknowledgement of Ravenwood or the man who pioneered such techniques. Declassified documents from the 1960s hint at another layer. During both world wars, government agencies expressed interest in behavioral modification research drawn from psychiatric practices. Memoranda floated the idea of applying these techniques to interrogation intelligence, even soldier conditioning. While no direct line from Ravenwood to later programs like MK Ultra can be proven, the conceptual lineage is undeniable. The last man alive with first-hand knowledge of Ravenwood was Dr. Thomas Weldon, a junior physician under Thorne in 1903. Interviewed in 1965, Weldon offered perhaps the most chilling assessment of all. What happened at Ravenwood wasn't an aberration. It was too honest, too visible. Thorne's error wasn't his methods, it was his arrogance. He believed he'd be celebrated for keeping records. Others did the same kind of work, only quietly, without paper trails. He showed the mirror none of us wanted to face, that medicine is not always about healing. Sometimes it's about sacrifice. Weldon described walking away after witnessing a patient subjected to simultaneous chemical sedation and crude electrical brain stimulation, a procedure that left the man permanently impaired. When Weldon voiced alarm, Thorne dismissed his concerns with a chilling certainty. The individual outcome doesn't matter. What matters is the knowledge gained. Weldon abandoned psychiatry soon after retreating into the quiet life of a country doctor in Ohio. He admitted he once tried to warn medical authorities, but when no reply came, he convinced himself he had exaggerated what he saw. It was easier than living with the truth that he too had been complicit. In 1969, with whispers of Ravenwood again stirring after the mass grave discovery, a coalition of prominent medical families petitioned the courts to seal the remaining records. Their request was granted. Today, those files sit in a climate-controlled facility in Harrisburg, inaccessible until 2029, 125 years after Ravenwood closed its doors. The sealing order contains language that is perhaps more damning than any record within it. It states that the restriction exists to protect the reputations of distinguished medical practitioners whose experimental approaches, while unconventional by modern standards, were conducted in good faith according to the scientific understanding of their era. And so Ravenwood remains both a ruin and a riddle. A place where progress was pursued without conscience, where the silence of patients became the foundation of research, and where history itself was rewritten to preserve reputations. The question that lingers is not whether Thorne was a monster, but whether his peers, by adapting his methods, by shielding his name, by sealing the truth, became something far more unsettling accomplices. This reframing of Thorne's work as merely unconventional, rather than grotesquely unethical, reveals a deeper truth and ongoing reluctance to fully confront the horrors that took place. A handful of historians and researchers still work to piece together the Ravenwood story, combing through fragments that escaped deliberate suppression. Their findings suggest that Thorne's influence extended far beyond Pennsylvania, shaping psychiatric practices across North America and Europe, well into the mid-20th century. Dr. Catherine Mercer of Columbia University has been one of the few willing to draw the connections openly. In a 2002 paper, she traced uncanny parallels between Thorne's experiments and institutional treatments used as late as the 1950s. The language changed, she observed, but the mechanics remained identities broken down through relentless physical and psychological stress, then rebuilt into compliant personalities through reinforcement and conditioning. What began as secret basement therapies at Ravenwood evolved into standardized psychiatric practices, their origins carefully stripped from the record. Mercer's work was met with resistance. Medical historians criticized her conclusions as sensational. Academic journals rejected her submissions, and colleagues urged her to distance herself from the subject. That resistance, she argued, only confirmed her point. The profession still flinched at the thought of acknowledging just how much of its past rested on ground first broken at Ravenwood. The asylum itself still stands, its skeletal walls and broken windows scattered across the Pennsylvania woods, As daylight fades, the ruins cast long shadows that stretch across the forest floor. There are no ghosts here, no spirits of the damned whispering through the corridors. What lingers is far more human than knowledge of what was done and how it was justified. Ravenwood is not haunted by the supernatural, but by memory of credentials, weaponized of cruelty, presented as progress of silence, maintained by those who found the results useful. Folklore has inevitably wrapped itself around the place. Teenagers dare each other to break inside, claiming to hear whispers in the dark or glimpse figures moving in shattered windows. Paranormal investigators arrive with their equipment chasing echoes of the dead. But in doing so, they miss the point. These ghost stories soften the reality, transforming atrocities into entertainment, making them easier to dismiss. The true legacy of Ravenwood lies not in hauntings, but in the questions it forces us to ask about medicine power and complicity. As one historian put it, the most unsettling part of the Ravenwood story is not what happened within its walls, but how thoroughly the scandal was neutralized. The institution was closed, the record sealed, the truth buried. Yet the techniques lived on, absorbed into mainstream practice, scrubbed of their origins, but not their essence. If you ever find yourself driving west of Pittsburgh along Route 30, you may catch a glimpse of Ravenwood's last standing tower rising through the trees. Most travelers don't notice. Fewer still know what they're looking at. And perhaps that's exactly as Thorne would have wanted his name forgotten. His work hidden in plain sight, his legacy living on not as memory, but as method. As long as the story is told, as long as fragments of evidence survive, Ravenwood does not remain a haunted ruin, it remains a warning. A reminder of what happens when unchecked authority is handed to those who view the vulnerable as tools rather than people. The most credible accounts agree that on the night Harrison confronted Thorne, a fire broke out in the administrative wing. Whether sparked by accident, struggle, or sabotage, it created just enough chaos for something extraordinary to happen. Patients from the standard wards were briefly evacuated onto the grounds, and in that confusion, certain records vanished. Not destroyed, vanished. Some believe Harrison passed his documents to an ally within the staff. Others suggest an even more compelling possibility, that patient 47 freed in the turmoil escaped with proof of the atrocities committed against her and countless others. Fire records show the blaze began near the laboratories, a fact that implies more than coincidence. 3 firefighters later testified that the patients evacuated during the incident behaved unnaturally. Instead of scattering in fear, they stood motionless in lines, calm and synchronized as though awaiting silent orders. One described them as moving like soldiers in formation. The fire's aftermath briefly drew outside attention. Insurance agents, county officials, and representatives from the medical board descended on Ravenwood. But within weeks, the story was contained. Official reports downgraded the incident to minor damage. Witnesses who spoke of strange behavior or missing patients were quietly discredited or dismissed. The Pittsburgh Tribune ran a short piece on November 8th mentioning unexplained disappearances during the evacuation. 4 days later, the article was retracted, citing reportorial error, and the journalist responsible was gone from the paper by month's end. Still, enough scraps of evidence survived to keep Ravenwood from being erased entirely. Not enough to secure justice. Too many years had passed. Too many reputations were protected. But enough to ensure that the asylum's darkest truths were never wholly buried. And then there is the question of Harrison. Officially, he suffered a nervous breakdown, was transferred to a private New York facility, and died in early 1904. Yet, no death certificate has ever surfaced. No grave carries his name. In the 1970s, a tantalizing theory emerged when researchers uncovered records of a physician in Western Canada, practicing from 1905 until 1937 under a different name. He bore Harrison's description, promoted humane treatment of the mentally ill, and became a fierce advocate for patient rights. Circumstantial evidence suggested it might have been him living in exile under an assumed identity, though conclusive proof was never found. Adding to the mystery, several of Harrison's former colleagues in Philadelphia reported receiving anonymous letters in the years following his supposed death. The handwriting was disguised, but the content-sharp critiques of psychiatric abuses and calls for reform sounded unmistakably like the man who once walked the halls of Ravenwood. Letters with no return address began appearing in the years after Harrison's disappearance, written in a hand that disguised itself but carrying a voice unmistakably his. They critiqued institutions by name, dissected their methods with clinical precision, and revealed an observer still watching psychiatry from the outside, someone unwilling or unable to stop holding the profession to account. Even now, Ravenwood surfaces in debates about medical ethics, a case study in what happens when scientific ambition operates unbound by conscience. Its horror does not rest in its uniqueness, but in its familiarity. What unfolded within those walls was not the anomaly of a single deranged man, but a reflection of attitudes that thrived in an era where results eclipsed humanity. How many lives were quietly sacrificed? How many families received lies in place of truth? How many careers were built on the scaffolding of suffering? Thorne recorded with such pride. The faintest survivor's voice may have emerged in 1958 when Helen Crawford published Fragments of Memory. She never named Ravenwood yet. Her descriptions of a western Pennsylvania asylum where patients were unmade aligned chillingly with what later evidence revealed. Her words spoke of memory gaps of fear carved into her bones, of being dismissed as delusional when she tried to tell her story. The book was ignored, the author forgotten, but in hindsight, her testimony reads like one of the only first-hand accounts of Thorne's experiments to survive. Crawford died in 1961, the very year Harrison's hidden papers resurfaced. Her most haunting passage lingers like a final testimony. They took pieces of us away, memories, emotions, the essence of who we were. Some never came back. Those of us who did returned incomplete, haunted by absences we could not name. The cruelest part was that no one believed us. Our trauma made us unreliable witnesses. The silence that once blanketed Ravenwood remains. Records are sealed graves, scattered and unnamed truths erased with deliberate precision. And yet fragments endure. In 2001, the local historical society placed a modest memorial at the entrance to what is now the Westmoreland Nature Preserve. Its inscription is simple. In memory of those who entered Ravenwood Asylum between 1887 and 1904, whose names and stories were taken from them. May their suffering not be forgotten. Each year on November the 1st, residents gather there in quiet remembrance, candles flickering against the dark. Modern psychiatry treats Ravenwood not as ghost story, but as cautionary scripture. A reminder of the ethical weight carried by those entrusted with vulnerable lives, of the line between healing and control of what happens when patients become subjects. Perhaps the last word belongs not to Thorne or Harrison, not to historians or survivors, but to an anonymous hand scratching words into the stone of a subterranean cell. Harrison copied the message into his journal, its plainness making it all the more devastating. I was someone before I came here. Remember that we were all someone before we came here. The ruins of Ravenwood Asylum still stand their hollow windows staring out across the Pennsylvania woods. For those who listen closely enough, the walls still whisper. Not with ghosts, but with memory, the kind that refuses to be erased.